G'day, welcome back. This is the next video in my series on corresponding squares, where I use that technique to analyze simple or more complicated pawn endgames. Now today I'm stretching it a little bit and using corresponding squares of a position to sort of introduce another lesser well-known chess figure from the very early days. So the guy we're looking at today is Van Zuylen, and we're going to look at that position, which I've shown there, the thumbnail, and we're going to analyze that using corresponding squares, which he did not do because that's like 100 something more years before that technique became more formalized. However, I think it's very interesting because obviously we'll learn about this figure in chess history, but also because he solved it more using the square and diagonal opposition and so on. We'll see the sort of relationship between corresponding squares and the more rule of thumb rules which people use in their chess games. Okay, so what we're going to do first is have a bit of a look here at Van Zuylen. Apologies if that pronunciation is terrible. To my capture screen, and we'll look at Wikipedia first. Now, this guy is really fascinating. So you can see he was born in 1743 and died in 1826. So he's a little bit overlapped with Philidor, obviously the most famous French theoretician of the era, and he played against Chapelle, I believe, and he's just kind of before the next really famous French chess player, La Bourdonnais. So that's sort of the framework, and then his life is quite a very interesting situation as well. You look at this period here, this is where the French Revolution caused chaos in most of Europe, and the sons Colette went through and basically took over Batavia or Holland, or United Kingdom of the Netherlands. And he was in the army, and he must have been a very savvy politician to be able to navigate the changes in the political situation at the time. Now, well, it's history of the person. This is a section on chess. He wrote this book, which I think is what he's most famous for. He wrote this book. I won't pronounce that. That translates as, if we go to Google Translate, it is, the book's full title was Superiority in Chess Made Easy for Everyone, and especially for ladies who love this amusement. Oh, there we go, that's quite a funny title. Anyway, the book seems to have been very well regarded, actually. Sort of the first sort of major book from the sort of Dutch tradition of chess. Now, back then we think of France and England and all that sort of stuff. Holland's always had pretty strong tradition. Obviously, he's got very strong players nowadays. And just one little tidbit I thought is his first poor son. He fought at the French side during the Peninsular War, and then by the time you get to Waterloo, he's fighting on the British side. So that's kind of curious. Now that's the Wikipedia. We'll close that. Let's Google Translate. So let's have a look at endgame studies. So he's actually got a page in the Arvas website. The people in there are in there because they have endgame studies. Now I think quite important to think about here is a lot of the books, not necessarily his one, but a lot of the books coming out in history, they tend to be just repackaging puzzles and openings from previous. A lot of plagiarization is, guess what I'm saying, right? So particularly from some of the Arabic manuscripts, which had a lot of chess endgames in them. There were some issues because obviously the rules were changing in terms of what was bear king a loss or a draw, was stalemate a loss or a draw, these sorts of things, right? So he had in his book, he's got a lot of endgame studies, and you can see king and pawn, king and pawn. Now what I did is I just flicked through these. So I picked there's quite a lot of them. I picked this one here. I thought this was kind of interesting because it sort of, we're going to do it by corresponding squares, but his solution there revolves around, as say, diagonal opposition is probably the one you'd think is the key thing. But anyway, you can see he's got many studies. Obviously, this is pretty good, this book, Het Schakspel. So, okay, so you can see the four things I just want to mention briefly in terms of the way you could solve this. First of all is the key squares for block pawns. I don't think I've covered that, but the idea is that the three squares either side of the pawn are regarded as, let's say, the critical squares, so that if the black king got onto those key squares, he would then be able to capture a white pawn. And in this case, the critical squares are also the key squares. I mean, if you get that pawn, you'll have 2 pawns against none, and you will be winning. So let's just see how that works in practice, right? Let's say black is able to get onto the d5 square. And a variation. I'm messing up. I'd saved here the line which Van Zuylen had, which is all about diagonal opposition, but not to worry. So now the black king is on one of those squares. Now, if you block over this side, it doesn't help because the king will just march across and grab the pawn. So the way to block is to actually go there. But this is that typical case where because that square is covered, black will be able to outflank white. And now what's white going to do? So he goes there, black goes there. And that square is blocked as well in this case. So basically, the black king can get across to the pawn and win the game. So that's just the thing about going back to the original position. Key squares. They're the key squares. right? Okay, the second thing I wanted to sort of highlight here is what about counter-attacking possibilities? So often in corresponding squares, we're talking about the pawn being able to march down to queen, but we're also talking about maybe the king could grab the pawn and his own pawn would go forwards. Okay, so let's just sort of look at that. Black does something. Black's winning already. Moving the king up to e5 was wrong. And we can look at that later. So let's say now that white decides the counterattack, because as soon as he moves his king forwards from this position, the black pawn will march through. So let's do counting here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's 6 moves to queen. Let's have a look at the black side. 1, 2, 3, 4. So obviously the counterattack is never going to work. So white will be at least one tempo short, and he will, and because it's a G pawn or a knight pawn, then black will be able to do the normal checking procedure. So the counterattack does not work. Okay, so let's go to the next, back to the starting position. A bit of color on there, but never mind. Next thing I wanted to highlight was the square. Got diagonal position there, but I wanted to look at the square. Normal way people do it: diagonal line, go up, across, down if you like. So basically white has to stay inside of that square box, otherwise if he moves outside it, then the black pawn will advance and he will lose. So this means that all these squares along here are not accessible by the white king. So if you look at the starting position, you might think, oh, why don't we just pop over to c4? But of course you're outside the square, and then black would win by advancing his pawn. So that was the square. Okay, cool, let me delete that. And then the final thing I want to talk about is diagonal opposition. The only drawing line here is the line king e4, takes the diagonal opposition. And in this position, there's one thing you've got to understand is that now this rectangle, white can keep black out of that rectangle, which is important because they were the key squares we just highlighted. Because what happens if black decides to go along this line, then white will be able to block like that. And if black decides to go down this line, then white will be able to block like that, taking the opposition. So that's what the diagonal opposition enables white to do. Because he has diagonal opposition, he can keep black out of that rectangle, and he keeps black out of that rectangle. That's all he needs to do. So okay, I think I've sort of there's those 4 things. I think in terms of the traditional way of analyzing it, you look at diagonal opposition, the square, the counterattack possibilities, and the block squares, and the key squares of block pawns. But now we're going to flip it on its head, and we're going to try and look at this from a corresponding squares perspective. So just 1 second, let me bring up my little simulator, which will help with this. Okay, we've seen this before. The idea is that I'm moving one piece around the board, black king in this case, and it's telling me where the white king needs to be. But you can see at the top there, this is black to move, white to win. Well, white's obviously going to win that position. Let's change that to the result is a draw. Okay, so now we're getting funky stuff. So if the black king's on b6, there's only one drawing square, d4. That's pretty interesting. Okay, so here is the starting position. The black king's on c6, and indeed the white king has to move to e4 and take diagonal opposition. Smooth the king across. Okay, on d6, white has to take the opposition. White has to take the opposition. Well, let's take it. Black can't actually go there, so we'll ignore that. And then what about if black comes the other way? So black comes down this way, exactly what I said. White can hold the opposition and black can't get in. Okay, there's a funny situation there, but let's have a look at that. So you can see exactly what I said, that by having diagonal opposition, you keep black out of that rectangle. Now you might be curious about what's going on there. Well, actually the funny thing is that if the black king's on c1, white can go to e3, because now the king runs under here. You get this funny alternative reality where white holds black out will be a draw. Black cannot get in. Okay, so that's good. So what we've shown there is that by getting diagonal opposition in this position and then holding normal opposition in the other squares which black might go to, you keep black out. Okay, so now this is where it gets tricky. As we've seen in a lot of cases, what happens if black backs off? You either take diagonal opposition or direct opposition. So on b2 though, you need to be there. You need to be taking opposition, you take opposition. So you're holding black out of the square again. So now it's just a bigger square you're holding it out of. Right, so actually that makes sense. Right, so you can't go to the C file, yeah, and if you went to D5, then black would come back and take the opposition against you. So that I think it's pretty clear. So hope that little simulation is helpful. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our analysis board and map out all those, not all of them, but map out the relevant corresponding squares, particularly the ones going down here, which make a lot of sense, and also the ones here, which similarly is basically just holding your position against the black king. So let's switch back to the skid versus PC board. 1 second. Okay, here I am. Let me delete all that color. Okay, it's good. Right. So what we've decided is that corresponding square 1, corresponding square 1, corresponding square 2, we need to go there. 3, we need to go there, so that'll be a split square. And then if black went the other way, 4, 4, 5, sorry, 6, 6, 7, 7, 8, 8. Okay. So now we can fill in the extra row. A. You saw this was also A. Yeah. B, B, C, C, D, D, E, E, and this will be F, and this square here is also F. Basically what's happened is if black backs off that far, you just go to the next diagonal opposition opportunity and box the black king out. So now let's actually go through his analysis. So then Zuylen gives 2 main lines, king e4, the drawing line, and he does king e5. He does do king e5, the losing line. Let's see what happened with king e5. Then he gives king c5, and that's where we did our count, so the counterattack doesn't work. And then the continuation he gives is, well, he does mention king f6 loses to h4, so he gives king e4, and then now king c4. White goes forwards again here, then black will move it around the back. White tries to play it off. And we have this position which we had on earlier lines. Okay, so let's go back to start. King e3 is not Van Zuylen, but just king e3, king d5 loses straight away, so that's no issue, right? So let's go to his king e4, main line. Get the colors up. Now king d6 is a possibility. King d4. Take the diagonal opposition there. There's some alternative lines. So king c6, can't go to c4, so you just keep the diagonal position. King c5, block that way, like we said, so he's blocked out on the, can't get onto the d file. And if he backs off, then we re-challenge like that. And I've gone over a bit quicker this time, but obviously what we're saying is like when you're on that square, threatening to go there, and then sort of through this square, covering the concern. So that's all good. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about today. So hope you enjoyed that. Thank you very much for watching.